Good morning, everyone. It is a real honor to be invited to speak to you today. In my lifetime, Martin Luther King remains the most passionate, patriotic protector of the American promise that I can identify. And so it's a real honor to be here today. I must say, when I got up, though, in my brother's home this morning over in Caryville, saw the weather, left a little early to come this way, got lost. The defroster on my pickup truck didn't work, so I was wiping the windshield and stopped at a gas station to ask where this location was. Nobody knew where this place was. So obviously I was panicked. But then I realized something that my Arapaho elders taught me, which is if your path is too smooth, you're on the wrong path. So we're on the right path today. When Mr. Smith called me a month ago to invite me to come speak, you know, as an 8th generation white Mississippian, my first question was, do you have the right phone number? But he assured me he did, and so we proceeded to talk about what he'd like me to speak about here today, and about eternal vigilance and moral courage. And can you put the first slide up? Yeah, why don't you set that? Anyway, to talk about eternal vigilance and moral courage in protecting the promise of America. And he also said, though, Bernie, we want you to be as upbeat and positive and nonpartisan as you can be in this presentation. So I thought, well, this will be easy. I'll just let them introduce me, and then I'll stop and ask if you have any questions. You know, the truth of the matter is, when it comes to voting rights, there's more than enough credit and blame to hand out to all political parties in this country. So while all of my remarks will not appear to be nonpartisan, I hope they'll appear to be fair and balanced before I'm done. What is the promise of America? Well, Thomas Paine, back before the American Revolution, wrote, "The right of voting for representatives is the primary right by which all other rights are protected. To take away this right is to reduce a man to slavery." Almost 2 centuries later, Dr. King said, "So long as I do not firmly and irrevocably possess the right to vote, I do not possess myself. I cannot make up my mind. It is made up for me. I cannot live as a democratic citizen." So here we have 2 patriots speaking 2 centuries apart, saying essentially the same thing. Now, does that mean that there was no progress in the 2 centuries? No. Does it mean that we had or ever will achieve the ideal of protecting voting rights for everyone in this country and never have to work again? The answer is no. The truth is that when it comes to social justice movements, be it civil rights, women's rights, workers' rights, voting rights, we are never allowed to win. We are only allowed to keep fighting. And the real reason I'm here today, frankly, is that I was raised right. By an Irish Catholic suffragette grandmother who, when she was brought south to Mississippi, caught more grief from her in-laws for having already voted in the state of Illinois than for being, as they called her, a papist Yankee. I was raised right by her husband, my grandfather, a small-town physician and farmer who always came when he was called to the bed of any sick person, regardless of their race or economic circumstance. I was raised right by my father, another small-town physician and farmer, And by the way, my grandmother was a Democrat, my grandfather and father were both Republicans. My father caught considerable grief from other farmers in his area when he decided to be the first in the area to pay his black and white field workers the same daily wage. And I was raised right by my mother, a Democrat, who worked long and hard in Chattanooga to see to it that her children could go to the first integrated high school in Chattanooga, Notre Dame High, and who, when she was confronted by a white-sheeted protester trying to keep the public schools from being integrated in Chattanooga, decided to enliven the color of his outfit by splashing some hot coffee all down the front of it. So that's what I mean by being raised right. But as I grew up in Mississippi, I want to give credit to a few guiding angels who helped mold me and many others. I hope many of you in this room recognize Miss Fannie Lou Hamer, a Mississippi Delta sharecropper who lost her job and her home the day she tried to register to vote. And because Ms. Hamer was, as she so famously said, sick and tired of being sick and tired, she would not be quiet, and instead rose to be the vice chairman of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. But I had another guiding angel, Ms. Lilla Pratt Roseman, a white North Mississippi plantation owner, who gathered all of her family's employees within a few weeks of the discovery of the bodies of Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, buried not an hour from my hometown, asked how many of her employees wanted to register to vote, and then walked the several blocks to the courthouse and stood silently while every one of her employees was allowed to register to vote in 1964, and refused to allow any impediments to be put in their path that day. We all were raised right by the example of Dr. King, and I wanted to put his picture here because when I was a senior in high school in '66 and had a decision as to which college to attend, Vanderbilt University invited that year both Dr. King and Stokely Carmichael to speak to the student body, and then issued the first athletic scholarship to Perry Wallace, the first black athlete to receive a scholarship in the Southeastern Conference. My mind was made up pretty easily that Vanderbilt was the place to go. By choosing to come north, as my friend said, to Tennessee to go to school, I learned fairly quickly that I had moved to a state which proudly can describe its own history of protecting, defending, and extending voting rights. And I want to share a few of my heroes who should be your heroes too. Now, the tall young man with the terrible haircut in the middle of this picture is Harry Byrne, the youngest legislator ever to serve in Tennessee, who had a young first-term Republican, who cast the deciding vote to give women the right to vote, not only in this state, but in the entire country. Tennessee was the last state to ratify that amendment, and Mr. Byrne's vote was the deciding vote. I want to honor and acknowledge the World War II veterans in Athens, Tennessee, who came back from the war and announced publicly that there would be no more stolen elections in McMinn County. They created their own party, the GI Party, made up of both Democrats and Republicans, and encouraged people to show up and vote. And when the local corrupt Democratic sheriff deputized 200 out-of-county thugs to disrupt the election again, including shooting a black man trying to vote in the voting place that day, these veterans waged a 12-hour gun battle with the sheriff and the thugs to rescue the voting boxes, the ballots, and succeeded in doing that. And lo and behold, if the votes were as the votes were counted the way they were cast, the corrupt local machine was voted out, And historians credit the Battle of Athens, as it's called, with starting the good government movement in Tennessee. Now, I know that Dr. King would question those extreme tactics, but First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt didn't when she wrote a nationally syndicated column saying that when free people are denied the right to have their votes counted as their cast, despots should expect that they'll rise up, and they did. Charles Baker, I want to acknowledge him, a Republican from Memphis, who filed suit back in 1960 to change how we drew legislative districts. And the Baker v. Carr decision is now known as the one man, one vote decision. It should be called the one person, one vote decision, but that was then. That essentially now allows all of our votes to be counted essentially equally. And by the way, shifted a great deal of political power to the cities away from rural areas at the time. And I want to end this review of Tennessee history by showing two heroes in this picture. The young woman in the middle is Diane Nash, and the gentleman on the left is Mayor Ben West. In 1961, when students in Nashville were working to desegregate the lunch counters there, one of the local civil rights leaders' homes was bombed. And the day after, 4,000 people marched on City Hall in Nashville. Mayor West, being a morally courageous man, was waiting for them on the steps of the City Hall. He didn't hide in his office. Ms. Nash approached him and quietly asked two questions. Mayor West, do you believe that it is right to discriminate against people on the basis of their race or color? And Mayor West said, no, young lady, I do not. And she said, well, then would you use your own power of persuasion and authority to help end desegregation in our lunch counters in Nashville? Mayor West said, yes, young lady, I will. The next day, the Nashville Banner headline said, integrate lunch counters, West. Ms. Nash went on to be a guiding angel of a number of voting rights efforts, including efforts in Alabama. Mayor West went on to lose his next election. But when asked years later about that one-on-one conversation on the steps of City Hall, Mayor West said, you know, when she asked me those questions, I answered the only way I knew how, as a God-fearing man and not a politician. Right. These days in America, we could use a lot more God-fearing leaders and a lot fewer who pretend to speak for God. Now I want to jump forward. We could spend the rest of the time talking about other heroes in this state, but I want to share my own story. Let's jump forward to 2004. We had a highly contested race for president, and I had some time on my hands, so I thought, what can I do to help this effort? So I talked to the local Walmart in Columbia, and they let me set out a bench in front of the door there in Walmart, and I personally registered 909 people to vote for that election. I was honored, I'm still honored, to have personally registered 4 women, all in their 70s, who had never voted in their lives, but who said that this election is too important for me to sit on the sidelines. But for every one of those 909 people I voted, there were at least 5 people who walked by and just blew me off. Said, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who you vote for. They're going to put in who they want. And of course, I sat there trying to encourage them to register. But then I woke up the day after that election and learned something. In the famous words of that great leader, so-called, Joseph Stalin of Russia, who once is said to have said, "Those who cast the votes decide nothing, those who count the votes decide everything." And what had happened in that election, and if you remember in 2000 with the hanging Chad controversy in Florida, a bill had been passed in Congress called the Help America Vote Act, which offered states over $4 billion to so-called upgrade their voting equipment. Unfortunately, for most of those states, the upgrades involved buying touchscreen voting machines. Well, for all their bells and whistles, there are several problems with these machines. The first is that, like any computer, they're subject to programming error, equipment malfunction, and malicious tampering. I mean, that's possible with any equipment. Secondly, the programs used in these voting machines are proprietary information, not open to inspection even by election officials. No one is allowed to look at the programming of the machines. And finally, these machines produce no paper trail and thus have no ability to conduct a recount. Now, even if the machines were open to inspection, you know, and the programming could be seen, there's another way these machines can be used to negatively impact the election, and that's how many machines get assigned to which precinct. In the state of Ohio, in 2004, using this equipment, black voters had to wait 5 times longer than white voters to cast a vote, based on how the machines were distributed. And the machines were 3 times more likely to break down in black precincts than white precincts. So again, even if we could, if they were open source, they can still be used inappropriately. By the way, that second point, you know, trusting our votes to private corporations using proprietary information that no one can look at, that's like the US Department of Energy deciding to license a nuclear power plant in Fly, Tennessee, with the provision that no one would be allowed to inspect how the plant operates nor measure the output of the plant. And in case you're wondering, please don't ever do that. Okay, I'm going to talk about some evidence from the 2004 election. I tell people who don't understand what an epidemiologist is that we're a truth teller. So I'm going to tell a little truth here about that election. Please bear with me. In the 2004 election, voters in at least 14 states, including Tennessee, witnessed their votes flipping right in front of their eyes on the machine from their choice for a president to another. People voted for Kerry and saw their vote going to Bush. They voted for Kerry and saw that their vote was erased. They voted for Kerry, or they voted rather a straight Democratic ticket, and then when they reviewed their votes at the end, they saw that yes votes appeared for every Democratic candidate except for Kerry, where it was blank. They voted for Kerry and their vote switched to a Green or Libertarian or some other candidate. Now, I'd like for this slide to be more fair and balanced than it is, except that of the 100,000 voters who reported watching their votes flip in that election, 98% of the flips favored Bush. Another problem associated with machines occurred in 2004. And the first 2 points here will be about undervotes. In heavily Hispanic and American Indian precincts in New Mexico, over 25% of the votes cast showed no choice for president. In heavily working class precincts in Pennsylvania, 70 to 80% of the votes cast showed no vote for president. However, in one Ohio precinct, Guyana Ward 1B, voting machines reported that Bush received 4,258 votes. The only problem was only 638 people voted in that precinct. Now, I know this is a scientifically sophisticated audience, so this is my last statistical slide. This slide shows the difference between the exit poll results from 2004 and the recorded vote in 2004. And that straight line you see up in the middle of the blue, if how people said they voted at the exit polls matched perfectly the reported vote, then you'd have no difference, and the state would fall right on that line. If you look over in the far right, you see that 7 states, Senator Kerry actually got slightly more votes than the exit poll would have suggested, but all of the difference was clearly within the margin of error. All of the spikes you see, though, on the left are the 43 states where Bush received more reported votes than people said they voted when they came out of the exit poll. Now, what does this slide mean? A Penn State University professor of statistics wrote a report where he analyzed the difference, and he said the likelihood that these patterns would have occurred by chance is so minuscule. As I was trying to find you guys this morning, I stopped and bought a Powerball ticket. One set of numbers on this Powerball ticket. According to that Penn State University professor, I am 100,000 times more likely to win Powerball tonight with this single ticket than that these votes occurred by chance, this pattern occurred by chance. Okay, so, you know, that's a discouraging set of figures, but let me give you some good news. In 2004, only 8 states in this country required that the use of voter-verified paper ballots, either voting on the paper ballot directly or having a printer attached to the screen so that a ballot would be presented that the voter could confirm. Only 8 states required that in 2004. Today, 40 states have that requirement. And they have it because a lot of American voters haven't won Powerball. In addition to what's going on in this country, about 90% of the democracies on this planet have never voted anyway except paper ballots. But in recent years, Ireland, the Netherlands, Germany, and India, among other countries, have all banned any kind of unverifiable voting system. So, you know, that's good news. Well, I should have said at the beginning that my Navajo elders taught me that if you could not say anything nice about someone, you could always say they live in a beautiful state. Well, only one state, only one U.S. state has repealed its voter-verified paper ballot law, and that beautiful state is Tennessee. I showed you a lot of heroes early on. Here's another one. Is Mayor Burchett in the room? Okay. Our own history of passing the Voter Confidence Act is an interesting history. After the 2004 election, our group started working with legislators to pass the Tennessee Voter Confidence Act, which would do away with unverifiable equipment, send us to paper ballots, counted electronically initially, but then available for recount if necessary. In 2008, all but 2 legislators voted for our bill. I mean, a phenomenal, nonpartisan show of support. But then in 2008, when our legislature shifted from one party to the next, and by the way, that shift is still described by political scientists nationwide as the most unexplainable outcome of the 2008 election. By the way, the last election we were supposed to have happen on using unverifiable equipment. Suddenly, the new party in power decided that of their 3 legislative priorities, one was to repeal the Voter Confidence Act. It took them 3 years to do it, they've done it. But in 2009, when the first effort to repeal the law occurred, the votes were pretty much along party lines, except then Senator Tim Burchett from Knoxville, who had chaired the Voter Confidence Joint Committee in the legislature, was the only Republican senator to vote to keep the bill intact and on track. By his decision, the repeal of the bill was delayed another year. I showed you a number of passionate, patriotic leaders. Add Senator Burchett, now Knox County Mayor Burchett, to that list. He was raised right. Now, what else is going on in 2011 to subvert the consent of the governed in the U.S.? Bills to restrict or interfere with voting rights have been, last year were introduced in 34 states, and some of those bills passed in 14 states. Just the bills that passed in those 14 states are estimated to impede lawful registration and or voting by over 5 million eligible voters coming up in the next election. Only Florida, the state where democracy goes to die in this country, passed more voter suppression laws than the beautiful state of Tennessee. These laws, for the most part, were drafted by a group called the American Legislative Exchange Council, whose founders said openly, our leverage in the elections quite candidly goes up as the voting populace goes down. I have never seen a more anti-American sentence in my life than that sentence. What are some of these bills? Well, bills were presented and in some cases passed to restrict voter registration drives. There are several states now that have passed bills that make it illegal for someone like me to sit in front of Walmart and register people to vote. And those restrictions are so onerous that in some of those states, the League of Women Voters and the NAACP have announced they're going to suspend their voter registration drives because they cannot meet the requirements of the new law. Laws limiting when and where people can register to vote have been passed. Laws creating enhanced eligibility requirements, including a much longer residence requirement. In a few of these states, if you move, say, from Mississippi to one of those states, you have to live in that state for a long period of time even to be eligible to vote. Again, which makes no sense. Improper and erroneous purges of voter rolls. Please hope that if we start purging the rolls in Tennessee, you don't have the same name as well, Tennessee's a bad example, but in the state of Florida, it's a good example. They still restrict the rights of ex-felons to vote, and if your name is the same as a felon, you're going to lose your right to vote just by having the same name. Restrictions on absentee voting have been put in place. Reductions in the number of early voting days. By the way, in my county, over half the people now vote early. It's particularly for working folks, early voting is really a useful tool. They're restricting the number of days now that people can vote early. In several states, laws have been reversed that initially allowed ex-felons or people with a felon history, once they'd completed their sentence, to vote again. Several states now have re-disenfranchised those voters. And finally, last but not least, photo ID laws, which we've all heard a great deal about, and which we've passed now in Tennessee. Well, as I'm wrapping up my comments, let's talk just about this law. Are photo ID laws necessary? Well, the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School has analyzed the number of cases of voter fraud nationally that might have been prevented by a voter ID law. And in their study, they said that nationwide only 9 fraudulent votes would have been prevented by photo ID laws since 2000. Out of over 400 million votes cast nationwide just in general elections alone. In Ohio, only 4 fraudulent votes would have been prevented in 2002-2004 by a photo ID law out of over 9 million votes cast. Remember Guyana Ward 1B? That one precinct presented over 1,000 times more fraudulent votes in the machines than this study said occurred statewide that would have been prevented by voter ID. What do these laws do? I've told you what they don't do. What do they do? Well, they do impose costly burdens on voters, many of whom are the least likely to afford the time and expense to jump through the hoops necessary to get an ID they don't have. And those voters include the elderly, the young, and the poor or working class, who can't afford to take off work to go stand in line at Motor Vehicle Division to get a photo ID. These laws do disproportionately impact non-white voters. Nationwide, the Brennan Center estimates that 25% of eligible black voters lack valid photo IDs. According to these laws, 16% of Hispanic voters versus only 8% of white voters. Okay. In conclusion, and I certainly hope I've stayed somewhere in the time frame here today, but if I run over again a little bit, please forgive me. I know your cubicles are calling your names, but there's no better day to practice a little civil disobedience than Martin Luther King Day. So bear with me and I'll wrap up here. In conclusion, if we as Americans never stop fighting to preserve and protect our voting rights, we will not lose. If we never stop fighting, we will not lose. However, we won't win either, you know, but at least we will be allowed to keep fighting. That's the point of this. We're never done when it comes to social justice. We're never done when it comes to protecting the promise of America. Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. And as my Hopi elders taught me, and my president so eloquently reminded me, we are the ones we've been waiting for. All of us are the ones we've been waiting for to do this. Let me finish on a personal note. You can only imagine how discouraging it was for me and members of our group to get a good government bill passed and then to have it repealed. And as the old spiritual says, lately I've been feeling worried and weary. You know, and when you feel worried and weary, sometimes what you do is you stop. You tap into all the weapons of mass distraction that we have in this country today, and you run the risk of becoming a facetious twit instead of an American patriot, which we all should be. But then I realized, you know, as I was preparing this talk, I could have stood up here in front of you and simply reviewed Dr. King's legacy. And it would have been an easy presentation to do. But as I was thinking about that, I envisioned Dr. King looking at me and saying, enough about me, Bernie. Talk about what everyone in your audience can do. Talk about what others have done to protect this country. And I realized that Dr. King's words are as meaningful and powerful today as they were in '67, when he said, "We are now faced with the fact, my friends, that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. We must move past indecision to action." Those words are as true today as they were when he spoke them in '67. Dr. King said, one of all of our guiding angels said, the time is always right to do what is right. Amen. Always right to do what is right. Well, the other thing I realized as I was preparing for this presentation is that, you know, it's not about me either. It's about, in my case, Grace Hopkins Ellis, my grand goddaughter and namesake. Grace not only is one of the most beautiful children ever born on the planet, but you know, I realized that if Grace and her other Black and Asian and Hispanic and white cousins who make up the 10th generation of my Mississippi family are going to remain free, then we have to remain brave. We have to be eternally vigilant. We have to exercise the moral courage necessary to be brave. In grace, we will. I want to wrap up by giving you two things. If you haven't read it yet, read the recent NAACP report, which is listed there at the top, Defending Democracy, Confronting Modern Barriers to Voting Rights in America. It was released in December. It's an excellent 50-page report. It's available online. If any of you here today would like me to share copies of this presentation or provide the documentation for any of the truth I've told you in the last 20 minutes, email me, tracevu@gmaildotcom. I'm happy to do that. I started with a slide from Tom Paine. You know, in addition to saying that taking away voting rights is to reduce a man to slavery, Thomas Paine also said it is the duty of the patriot to protect his country from his government. I hope I'm in a room full of patriots today. I hope I'm in a room full of God-fearing people today. I hope I'm in a room filled with passionate, patriotic protectors of the American promise. We are the ones we've been waiting for. If you're waiting on me, you're backing up. Let's do what we have to do to protect voting rights, because that is what the American promise is. It's not anything else. It's that. Mr. Smith, I think you're closing up. I'd like you to come up here if you can. My tribal elders also taught me that you don't ever go into someone's home without bringing a gift. So I brought two gifts today. When we did the National Election Reform Conference back in 2005, we had 9 documentary crews show up to film it. We had no one from the corporate media show up. But we had 9 documentary film crews show up. 6 documentaries have been released so far. I'm leaving with Mr. Smith 2 of those that I think are 2 of the best. One is called Uncounted, the New Math of American Elections. The other one is called Stealing America, Vote by Vote. Those films will be with Mr. Smith. Thank you. You honored my entire family by inviting me here today. God bless all of you, and may God help America.